Welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you follow global diplomacy, you'll know that September 2025 was, well, quite a month. Decades of entrenched consensus just seemed to shatter. We're diving deep today into what some are calling a massive geopolitical earthquake, this whole recognition wave for the state of Palestine by some really major Western powers.
It really is difficult to overstate the magnitude of this shift. I mean, for 70 years, the prevailing diplomatic doctrine, largely pushed by the United States and its closest allies, it held firm.
Right.
The line was no unilateral recognition of Palestine. Statehood, they always argued, had to be the final outcome of direct talks with Israel.
And
that wall is, well, it's fundamentally breached. It's just gone.
Okay, let's unpack this. We've synthesized a whole stack of global sources tracking this pivot pretty much in real time. And the numbers alone, they confirm the break, don't they?
They really do. As of late September 2025, Palestine is recognized by 157 UN member states.
157. Right.
That's an astonishing 81% of the entire UN membership. Now, that figure represents a huge leap, obviously, but the real story isn't just the total number, it's who finally joined that list.
Exactly, that's the core of it. This action, it broke that long-standing Western consensus of, let's be frank, unconditional support for Israel, didn't it?
It absolutely did.
Yeah.
And the sources are really definitive on this. France took a central, very active role in kicking off this collective, coordinated action.
So Paris was the main mover.
It seems so. For major Western capitals, Paris, London, Ottawa, to move together almost in lockstep on this issue, that's a strategic pivot that honestly was considered almost impossible just a couple of years ago.
So our mission today is to trace this whole development. Where did it start? We need to go back to the earliest roots, really detail the road that led us here. We need to analyze which Western powers did what exactly in 2025. And maybe most importantly, figure out what this diplomatic rupture, this geopolitical earthquake truly means.
Yeah.
For the future of the region, for global stability. Who decided it was finally time to flip the script, and why now?
Well, while France seems to have been the central orchestrator, you needed the others. The UK, Canada, Australia. They provided the necessary political weight, the mass, to create this wave.
Right.
But to understand the sheer gravity of this decision, we really have to start where the conflict itself started, which means looking at the historical pursuit of statehood. That's a story that's now over a century old.
Okay, history time. This struggle for statehood, it's rooted in a fundamental contradiction, isn't it? As our sources keep reminding us, it really goes back to 1917.
The Balfour Declaration, yes.
Yeah.
That's where the United Kingdom publicly supported establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine.
And that moment, it created this competing claim on the land.
Irrevocably. It's at the stage for the next 100 years of conflict, essentially. Fast forward 30 years, 1947, the UN tries to sort of head off the friction with Resolution 181.
The partition plan.
Exactly. Proposing a specific plan for independent Arab and Jewish states, side by side.
But that effort failed almost immediately.
Right. The plan was rejected outright by the Arab nations. They saw the partition as, well, an unacceptable theft of their territory.
And that rejection, of course, led directly to the 1948 war.
And the Nakba, the mass displacement of Palestinians, and ultimately the founding of the State of Israel.
So as Israel was solidifying its statehood, the Palestinian response took longer to formalize.
It did. It wasn't until 1964 that the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, was formed. And its initial goal was pretty uncompromising. Independence, pursued through armed struggle against Israel.
Okay, but the first real diplomatic breakthrough for Palestinian statehood, that came much later, right? 1988.
That's right. In Algiers,
Yeah.
the PLO declared the State of Palestine. What's often forgotten, I think, is the immediate reaction to that declaration.
Which was?
78 nations instantly recognized it, just like that.
78. And who were they, mainly?
And this is where you see those early geopolitical divisions starting to form, the ones that really persisted right up until this 2025 shift, those 78 nations. Overwhelmingly from the Arab bloc, African nations, the Soviet bloc.
So the global south, essentially.
Pretty much.
Okay.
Establishing this historical precedent that actually the majority of the world did recognize Palestine, even if the powerful Western G7 bloc refused to budge.
Okay, then the next major diplomatic moment, the one often remembered with this sense of, immense hope, almost painful hope, was Oslo. The Oslo Accords, 1993 to 95.
Yeah, Oslo. Sadly, it turned out to be more of an illusion of peace than any real foundation for it. Well, the Accords established the Palestinian Authority, the PA. It was intended as a temporary self-governing body in parts of Gaza and the West Bank. But here's the crucial flaw, the structural failure that our sources really highlight, and it's arguably what doomed the next 3 decades.
It was.
The agreements deliberately, consciously avoided defining the really big issues: final borders, the status of Jerusalem, and, critically, they didn't guarantee Palestinian statehood. That was left for later.
But wait, hang on. If Oslo was supposed to be this peak of hope, why would both sides sign documents that deliberately kick the can down the road on the most fundamental issue, statehood? Was it just, I don't know, fundamentally incompatible goals from the start, or was it a failure of political will?
That's the core tragedy, isn't it? Analysts we looked at suggest it was probably a mix of both, of a failure of political courage, certainly on both sides, but also maybe an underlying incompatibility of their immediate goals.
How do you mean?
Well, the Israelis seemed to prioritize interim security guarantees before seriously discussing final status issues like statehood. The Palestinians, on the other hand, they needed that guarantee of statehood up front to establish the PA's legitimacy and make concessions possible.
So by creating this temporary, undefined structure, the PA, it just lingered.
Exactly. That temporary body effectively became permanent, but without a clear political destination. And this lack of a defined end state, it just choked off any real political progress and led, almost inevitably, you could argue, to the Second Intifada starting in 2000.
Right. Okay, so despite the diplomatic stalling from the big world powers, Palestine did keep trying to climb towards international legitimacy, didn't it?
Slowly, yes. Incrementally. In 2012, they achieved a pretty major symbolic victory. The UN General Assembly voted, get this, 138 in favor, only 9 against, to upgrade Palestine to a non-member observer state.
A big symbolic step.
It was huge. And it wasn't just symbolic, actually. It unlocked certain mechanisms for international engagement. Specifically, in 2014, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, acknowledged Palestine as a state.
Okay, and what did that mean practically?
It meant Palestine could now, theoretically, pursue accountability for actions related to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza through the court. Gave them a new legal avenue.
So the ICC acknowledgement gave Palestine actual legal standing to challenge sovereignty issues, occupation actions, on an international stage, something they couldn't do before.
Precisely. But before 2025, the Western stance remained rigid. The U.S., most of the G7 nations, they strictly opposed any kind of unilateral recognition. They kept insisting on that negotiation-first framework.
Although we did see some cracks in Europe before this big wave.
We did. A few outliers. Sweden recognized Palestine back in 2014. Then Norway, Spain, and Ireland followed suit in 2024. But the real heavy hitters, France, the UK, Canada, they held the line firmly until September 2025.
So the historical data just makes this 2025 shift look truly monumental. You go from 78 nations recognizing Palestine in 1988, mostly the global south, to 157 in 2025. It really illustrates that the West was kind of the last major diplomatic bloc in the world to break its own consensus, finally yielding to, well, to what? To geopolitical pressure.
Which brings us right up to the immediate history. If the West had held that line for decades, what specific events, what calculations in the summer and early autumn of 2025 finally drove this dramatic, coordinated reversal?
Yeah, what was the final straw?
The sources are pretty unequivocal on this. The primary catalyst, the immediate trigger, was the sheer scale and, frankly, the duration of the conflict that started after the October 2023 Hamas attack.
It just went on and on.
It did. By September 2025, the resulting humanitarian crisis in Gaza had reached these devastating, almost unimaginable levels. We're talking over 65,000 casualties reported. The conflict wasn't just brutal, it seemed fundamentally intractable.
Leading to just impossible levels of global pressure, right? Moral, political.
Exactly. That sense of hopelessness, combined with the horrific rising death toll, it seems to have completely eroded the political viability of the old Western policy of essentially waiting for negotiations that weren't happening.
Inaction became untenable?
It really did. And this is where France made its move. During the 80th UN General Assembly in New York, French President Macron spearheaded this coordinated effort. He convened foreign ministers from 14 different nations.
And he called it the New York Call.
That's right, the New York Call.
Now, this wasn't just a political soundbite, was it? It was presented as a structured diplomatic plan. Can you elaborate on the specifics? What did this 15-month phased approach actually involve?
Yeah, this is a critical detail, I think. It elevates the move beyond just pure symbolism. The sources indicate the New York Call was designed as a proper strategic roadmap, and crucially, with accountability kind of baked in.
Okay, so what were the phases?
Phase 1, which kicked off with the recognition itself, involved immediate diplomatic strengthening of the PA, boosting its status. and coordinating peacekeeping forces under a UN mandate.
Peacekeepers.
Okay. But crucially, the recognition was conditional. Conditional on the PA undertaking significant, verifiable reforms, anti-corruption, governance reforms within the first 6 months.
Wow. So the Western powers were essentially saying, okay, we'll recognize you now, but you've got 6 months to prove you can actually be a credible governing partner, one capable of managing both the West Bank and, critically, post-war Gaza.
That's exactly the message. Then Phase 2, scheduled for months 7 through 15, was meant to focus on securing a permanent ceasefire and initiating really comprehensive border negotiations.
Underpinned
by the newly recognized, hopefully reformed, PA and the international backing from those UN peacekeeping efforts. Macron himself described his decision as a geopolitical earthquake. And to really solidify the move, he co-hosted a joint UN summit with Saudi Arabia on September 22nd, explicitly endorsing this New York call.
France and Saudi Arabia together, that's significant coordination.
Hugely significant. It demonstrated powerful coordination between a major European power and a key Gulf state, adding weight to the whole initiative.
What's fascinating here, then, is that the Western powers weren't simply granting statehood in a vacuum. They were actively using recognition as a kind of high-stakes diplomatic lever, weren't they, to try and force a specific political outcome.
That's the key distinction, I think. Every single major Western power that joined this wave attached pretty stringent conditions to their recognition. This signals they weren't just reacting to moral pressure, although that was huge. They were also strategically attempting to shape the post-war landscape.
Okay, let's drill down into those conditions. Starting with the UK, Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced recognition on September 21st. What were his specific requirements?
Starmer was very clear. He emphasized that the move had to actively maintain peace, it had to strictly adhere to the two-state solution framework, and this was a massive political caveat it had to ensure that Hamas was not in power or controlling the governance structure.
So trying to reassure people this wasn't pro-Hamas.
Absolutely. Aimed directly at reassuring both domestic audiences and, frankly, Israeli concerns that the move was anti-terrorist, not somehow endorsing Hamas.
And Canada moved the same day. Prime Minister Mark Carney echoed that sentiment.
Very much so. Carney stated the recognition was specifically intended to empower peace seekers and, crucially, not reward terrorism. Their recognition was explicitly tied to a major prerequisite: the immediate, verifiable release of all remaining hostages held in Gaza.
A direct link. Recognition for hostages.
A direct, almost transactional link between the diplomatic act of recognition and a concrete humanitarian outcome. Very deliberate.
Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese also joined in, linking their recognition to acknowledging legitimate Palestinian aspirations.
Yes, but again, mandating comprehensive Palestinian Authority reform alongside it.
So what's the common thread here across France, the UK, Canada, Australia, Belgium, others who joined?
The common thread was conditionality, almost universally. Demands for the demilitarization, or at least the removal from power of Hamas, the release of hostages, and comprehensive PA restructuring, ensuring stability, tackling corruption, especially regarding how any post-war Gaza reconstruction funds would be managed.
So a conditional embrace, designed to guide the political future, not just reflect the present.
Precisely.
Now, this action, it fundamentally reshapes the dynamics at the UN Security Council, doesn't it? Our sources really highlighted the immediate isolation of Washington on this.
Dramatically so. With France, the UK, China, and Russia now all recognizing Palestine, the United States stands completely alone. The only permanent member of the Security Council that has not recognized Palestine.
That level of isolation for the U.S. on a core Middle East issue, that's pretty much unprecedented, isn't it, historically?
It really is. And the online reaction, the X-platform chatter we tracked, it immediately seized on this strategic paralysis, almost. There was one post, user at Georgia Mitchich, I think, highlighting the U.S. being left alone among the P5. That just reflected the immediate public acknowledgement of this huge chasm that opened up between Washington and its traditional European allies.
So what's the practical implication of that P5 isolation? If the U.S. is the only holdout with a veto, does that mean the Security Council is effectively paralyzed on anything related to enforcing this recognition?
Well, yes, absolutely. It creates paralysis in at least two key ways. First, while you have 157 nations recognizing Palestine, the U.S. continues to veto Palestine's application for full UN membership.
Still just an observer state.
Exactly. So the diplomatic status remains stuck in non-member observer state, despite the wave of recognitions. Second, because the U.S. fundamentally opposes the mechanism used here, unilateral recognition outside of direct talks, any UN resolution proposed by, say, the UK or France that tries to enforce the conditions of the New York Call.
Like mandating PA reform benchmarks or deploying peacekeepers?
Precisely. Anything like that could potentially be vetoed by Washington. And that significantly dilutes the practical effectiveness of the entire recognition wave, doesn't it? Creates a major roadblock.
Okay, this clearly wasn't a spontaneous decision. It feels like a very calculated, coordinated diplomatic pivot, one that involved overturning decades of established policy. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, beyond just the horrific casualty count, why did the West decide now was the time to flip the switch? What were the underlying drivers?
Well, the first and probably the most powerful driver, you have to say, was the sheer pressure from their own populations.
Yeah.
Fueled by that humanitarian crisis.
The protests we saw.
Exactly. We're talking sustained, high-volume domestic protests across London, Paris, Ottawa, other capitals, right through late 2024 and into 2025. Governments were genuinely losing domestic political credibility over their perceived inability or maybe unwillingness to do something concrete to halt the conflict.
And the sources show that Western leaders actually acknowledged this pressure directly, didn't they?
They did. British and Canadian leaders, in particular, seemed to frame the recognition partly as a necessary way to, and this phrasing was remarkable, punish Israeli aggression.
Language you wouldn't have heard 5 years ago from them.
Absolutely unthinkable. And also to push for a definitive ceasefire, essentially proving to their own electorates that they were actively responding to this overwhelming moral urgency.
Okay, so domestic pressure was huge. What else?
The second major reason seems to have been strategic. The deployment of recognition itself as a new kind of diplomatic lever, a tool specifically designed to try and revive the completely stalled two-state solution.
How so? Because for years the policy was the exact opposite, wasn't it? Negotiation first, recognition later?
Precisely. The consensus flipped. Recognition is now being deployed as a diplomatic tool designed to force the peace process, or at least the conditions for it, back onto the table, not just wait for it.
That's a pretty profound inversion of their long-held strategy. How did the French initiative, the New York Call, argue that recognition would actually facilitate a solution rather than just hardening the positions of both sides even further?
Well, the goal, as defined in the New York Call, was quite specific. The strategy aimed to do two things simultaneously. First, weaken Hamas's legitimacy, both domestically within Palestine and internationally, by shifting all the international focus, the funding, the diplomatic energy towards the Palestinian Authority. Second, strengthen the PA's own legitimacy. But critically, through mandated reform tackling corruption, improving governance, and giving it robust international backing, especially that UN peacekeeping mechanism.
So the belief was that only a credible, internationally recognized PA, hopefully cleaned up and mandated to govern both territories, could actually be a true, viable negotiating partner for Israel down the line.
That seems to have been the core calculation, yes.
It's also fascinating here is how much Western frustration with long-term Israeli policies seems to have contributed to this decision. It wasn't just about the immediate crisis.
Oh, significantly. Western irritation, particularly in Europe, had been growing exponentially for years over Israel's continued expansion of settlements in the West Bank and over various unilateral annexation moves or threats.
Actions seen as undermining the two-state future.
Exactly. These were viewed by many Western capitals as actively, deliberately undermining the very possibility of a viable two-state future, regardless of how much diplomatic support Israel received otherwise. They saw the ground shifting under the policy.
So the coordinated recognition was also a deliberate act of diplomatic pressure on Israel, explicitly meant to push Israel to end its military operations and maybe fundamentally change its long-term strategy regarding the occupied territories.
It was absolutely intended as a shock to the Israeli system, no question. We have reports, as you mentioned, that Prime Minister Netanyahu acknowledged this increased diplomatic isolation. And the sources note his reported response to this pressure.
It was
pushing for this concept of a super Sparta economic approach, a way to try and withstand this mounting global pressure.
Okay, that concept, the super Sparta, it's only briefly mentioned in the source material we looked at, but it feels critical for understanding the potential long-term Israeli mindset shift here. What exactly does this doctrine entail?
Right. The super Sparta concept, as analysts were discussing it, seems to refer to a really drastic shift toward national self-reliance, almost an autarky model.
Meaning
an economic philosophy centered on massive increases in domestic defense spending, prioritizing secure domestic supply chains for critical goods, and adopting a kind of Well, an isolationist pragmatism, really.
Like digging in.
Exactly. It essentially says, look, if the world is going to be against us diplomatically, maybe even commercially, then we will become a fortified, technologically advanced, economically self-sufficient fortress, one capable of weathering prolonged international pressure, maybe even sanctions and isolation. It's a vision born out of feeling increasingly abandoned by traditional allies.
That's a powerful, almost bleak indication of the magnitude of the diplomatic isolation being felt in Jerusalem then. And we can't overlook the domestic and global political realignment driving this from the Western side either.
No, absolutely not. For many European countries, there was significant internal political pressure. Electorates with large and increasingly vocal Muslim populations were demanding policy shifts on Palestine. And governments recognized that failing to act was becoming domestically destabilizing.
And for the UK specifically.
For the UK, this wasn't just a slight pivot. It was framed as a defined movement away from what had been perceived as an almost unconditionally pro-Israel stance, moving towards a policy explicitly called balanced pressure. They essentially recognized that decades of near-singular support hadn't actually achieved stability or moved the two-state solution forward. Maybe the opposite.
So summing up the why, it was this perfect storm, really. Irresistible moral urgency from the humanitarian crisis, immense domestic political pressure, a strategic gamble to forcibly revive the two-state model using recognition as a lever, and deep, profound frustration with Israeli actions that were seen as consistently undermining peace efforts over years.
That seemed to capture it. It signals a clear Western shift away from that singular support model towards trying to impose a multi-party, balanced solution enforced, or at least initiated, by diplomatic recognition.
Okay, so the historic action has happened. The wave has washed ashore. Now we have to assess the immediate fallout. Let's start with the impact on Palestine itself. Is this newfound elevated international status purely symbolic, or is there actually some substantive benefit here?
Well, it's probably a mix of both, as you'd expect, but the substantive gains are potentially real, even if they are conditional for now. Palestine immediately gains a higher international status, legally speaking, and improved capacity to sign international treaties and conventions. And crucially, perhaps, a stronger position to pursue those accountability mechanisms we talked about at the ICC and other international bodies.
And the Palestinian leadership's reaction.
The official leadership, led by Mahmoud Abbas, called the recognition paving the road to peace, so publicly welcoming it.
But there's always a but. Our sources also highlighted some deep internal skepticism among Palestinians themselves, didn't they?
Yes, very much so. Without concrete Israeli action halting settlements, ending the occupation, some Palestinians are questioning if the move is merely symbolic. Especially since the conditions attached by the West, like that comprehensive PA reform, the demilitarization of Hamas, these are massive internal hurdles that Palestine itself has to clear first.
So, a sense of nice gesture, but what changes on the ground tomorrow?
That internal contradiction is definitely there, and it's important. Now, the reaction from Israel, as you'd expect, was fierce, predictably so.
Netanyahu's response?
Prime Minister Netanyahu vehemently opposed the move. He labeled it a direct reward for terrorism that, in his view, encourages further conflict rather than enabling peace.
And the security concerns on the Israeli side, they are genuine, aren't they? Analysts worry that this recognition might actually fail to stop the conflict, or worse.
Worse, it might actually lead to an accelerated, defiant annexation of parts of the West Bank by Israel as a kind of countermeasure to what they perceive as global diplomatic aggression against them.
And the U.S. position in all this, it highlights the complexity of alliance management, right?
Absolutely. Washington reiterated its commitment to stopping the war, of course, but it maintained its historical opposition to unilateral recognition outside direct talks. And its continued vetoing of Palestine's full UN membership application really reinforces this deep split between Washington and its key European allies on this fundamental issue.
Okay, globally, the immediate effect seems to have been deepening Israel's diplomatic isolation. But you mentioned earlier, the true measure of this recognition wave hinges on the follow-up action. If it's just flags being raised at embassies, it doesn't achieve much on the ground.
Exactly right. The sources really emphasize that to make this concrete, to give it teeth, there needs to be an active, functioning alliance between the EU and key Gulf states. That seemed to be the intent behind that joint French-Saudi summit.
If that alliance can translate recognition into enforceable policy,
then the move has real weight. And we are already seeing some concrete actions, however small. The source material specifically mentioned Spain's subsequent weapon embargo against Israel. That's one tangible step that moves beyond just symbolic statements.
We also have to acknowledge, though, that the diplomatic rift in the West isn't absolute. There are those uncommitted G7 members, Germany, Italy, Japan. These are major players. They have not recognized Palestine yet. Why did they hold back from joining this wave?
Yeah, that's important context. Their motivations probably differ slightly, but analysts suggest they share a core security calculation, perhaps. Germany, obviously, because of its historical responsibilities, has maintained this unique position of exceptional security commitment to Israel. That makes unilateral recognition incredibly politically fraught domestically.
And Italy and Japan.
They seem heavily focused on regional stability. They likely fear that recognition without immediate de-escalation on the ground could actually worsen the security situation, or maybe damage delicate diplomatic ties they hold with various players in the region. And it wasn't just G7. The Croatian parliament also registered formal opposition, showing the fracture runs deeper than just the biggest economies.
This raises a really important and difficult question that came up fiercely in the source material. We have to address this internal contradiction, the clash between the strong humanitarian argument for recognition and the equally strong Israeli argument that this is effectively rewarding terrorism. How do we navigate that?
Look, this is the central philosophical tension, isn't it? Proponents argue recognition is a moral imperative, a necessary step to grant dignity, legal recourse, statehood rights to a suffering population under occupation.
And the opponents.
Opponents argue that since the official ruling body, the PA, is perceived as weak, and Hamas still maintains significant influence and arguably popular support in some areas, recognition inadvertently grants legitimacy to the entire Palestinian political landscape, which includes groups explicitly committed to armed conflict against Israel.
And complicating it further, even internally, some Palestinian voices express discontent with the recognition wave.
Yes, our sources indicated that some key Palestinian groups argued that mere recognition, especially conditional recognition, is insufficient. They called instead for concrete actions like sanctions against Israel to actually enforce change on the ground. Some view the Western move as perhaps a chief substitute for real economic and political pressure.
So the central controversy really boils down to this. Will recognizing statehood ultimately strengthen moderate Palestinian forces, help isolate Hamas, and push forward the two-state solution by giving a reformed PA the leverage it needs?
Or will it simply prove ineffective in changing the hard facts on the ground, like continued settlement expansion, while simultaneously hardening the Israeli government's resolve to perhaps pursue that isolationist super Sparta vision we discussed? This recognition wave, it's truly a high-stakes geopolitical gamble. The outcome is far from certain. #TagDeadOutro.
Okay, we've established this was a genuinely historic shift, driven largely by a moral crisis and coordinated, it seems, primarily by France. But the consensus among the analysts we reviewed is pretty clear. Recognition alone, even conditional recognition, is simply not enough. So what are the short-term necessities now? What has to happen next now that the diplomatic world has shifted?
Well, the immediate necessity seems to be verifiable follow-up. Action, not just words. The sources stress the need for specific sanctions, perhaps, linked to those conditions laid out in the New York Call, and renewed high-level negotiations, potentially mediated by that French-Saudi alliance structure.
And at the UN.
We should absolutely expect Palestine to immediately relaunch its bid for full UN membership. That will force the U.S. to make a very public, potentially very isolating veto decision under increased global scrutiny. Puts Washington in a tough spot.
Looking longer term now, what does this new landscape really mean for the viability of the two-state solution itself, given the depth of the crisis, the sheer level of mistrust?
Well, the stated political goal is clearly to push the two-state solution forward. That's the justification. But the sources universally warn that the profound crisis of trust on all sides, Israel's distrust of a recognized Palestinian state's intentions, Palestinian distrust of the PA's ability and the West's commitment, it makes the long-term outlook look,
well, faint was the word one analyst used.
faint. Not exactly optimistic. Not really. Without genuine trust-building measures and tangible security guarantees for both sides, the risk is actually deepening isolation for everyone involved, which could, paradoxically, end up reinforcing Netanyahu's potential super Sparta vision, leading perhaps to a decade of self-imposed Israeli fortification against what it sees as a diplomatically hostile world.
Did our sources offer any concrete recommendations? Paths forward suggested by analysts for how Western powers could move constructively now, beyond just these symbolic gestures?
They did. There seem to be three key areas consistently highlighted. First, Western powers absolutely must move past just symbolic support and significantly strengthen their financial and political backing for genuine Palestinian Authority reform, ensuring it becomes a truly credible, non-corrupt governing body capable of managing both Gaza and the West Bank effectively. That's crucial.
Okay, PA reform first.
Second, the international community, led by those who just recognize Palestine, must exert serious, tangible pressure on Israel to actually dismantle illegal settlements. That's seen as a core factor undermining the physical possibility of a two-state solution. Without addressing settlements, recognition means less.
And third?
Third, structured, comprehensive Israeli-Palestinian dialogue must be somehow promoted, maybe even enforced, even amidst the current chaos, perhaps focusing initially on shared security frameworks before tackling the bigger final status issues. Keep talking, basically.
Right. Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, our listeners. The true test of this diplomatic earthquake, this massive coordinated wave of recognition, it isn't really going to be the number of flags raised outside new embassies or the updated tally at the UN, is it? The real test is whether this collection of high-minded symbolic conditions actually translates into a single mile of verifiable concrete change on the ground, an end to the occupation in practice, the dismantling of even a single illegal settlement, or the guaranteed effective functioning of a genuinely reformed Palestinian Authority. You have the facts now. You know the precise conditions that were attached by London, Paris, Ottawa. So the question becomes, what is the very next action the international community must take to move beyond mere symbolism and actually enforce the change they claim they want to see?
The stage is definitely set for a very dramatic few years ahead. The big question is whether the actors involved will actually follow the challenging script they've started writing.
The question we'll be watching closely. Thank you for diving deep with us into this profound geopolitical shift. We'll see you next time.